Ladies and gentlemen, give a very warm round to Brenda Trenowden.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the Economic Times of India for inviting me here. First of all, let me say I'm so delighted to be here because Mumbai is a place that's quite familiar to me. I spent a lot of time here in the early 90s and the early 2000s, and I have such a fondness for the place that I named my daughter India. But she's 16 now, and I certainly have a lot of hope for her. So thank you for giving me a good reason to come back. I've been asked to speak to you about why I believe that gender balance is important, how we're tackling it through the work of the 30% Club, and how it ties into what's happening here in India. So what I want to do first is really tell you what the 30% Club isn't. It isn't a women's network, and nor are we a group of women fighting for equal rights. What we are is a global campaign for better gender balance on boards, but also throughout organizations as a business initiative, not as a social one. The chairs and the CEOs that we have signed up all believe that the only way to have real, long-term, sustainable change is to have women and men working together on a voluntary, business-led basis because it makes good business sense. In a rapidly changing environment, all organizations need creativity and innovation to remain competitive, and that will only happen if we have diverse teams. There was a great study done by BCG in Europe in 2017, where 171 companies were surveyed on how innovative and how diverse they were. And the data came out and clearly showed that those companies that were the most diverse were also the most innovative. And conversely, those that were the most innovative were the most diverse. Now, it's difficult to show whether that's just correlation or whether there's causation, but certainly the link was very clear. And what it also showed was that companies needed to have at least 20% of women in senior leadership for it to have an impact on their innovation revenues. Companies that have achieved that threshold already are well known: Alibaba, JP Morgan, and Apple, to name but a few. And so I think that's quite a great argument in itself for more diversity. Unfortunately, however, in times of economic crisis, many organizations really let this drop down the agenda. They think it's a nice to have and it doesn't become a priority. But that's precisely the time when they need to be focusing on more diversity. There are literally mountains, I think, of research and studies that support the argument that more diverse boards and more diverse management teams are much more effective than identikit boards. They're better at decision making, and they're much better in terms of financial performance. Just to give you an example, research from McKinsey shows that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to have financial returns above their peers. Their Power of Parity report finds that $12 trillion could be added to global GDP by 2025 by advancing women's equality. It's also obvious that in an environment where there's increasing competition for talent, companies really need to cast their nets as widely as possible. Furthermore, studies by Catalyst show that companies with more women in senior management have lower staff turnover and better employee engagement scores. Their cultures are more inclusive and therefore better for everyone. And finally, there's growing external pressure for companies that are more inclusive to reflect their customers, their wider workforce, and society in general. So it all makes sense, doesn't it? It should just happen quite naturally, but of course it doesn't. And so what we've been doing through the 30% Club is to really try and influence change. We're really focusing our efforts on going out and talking about the business case and then really trying to talk to companies about what they can practically do. Just to give you a bit of background, we started in the UK in late 2010. Many of us were involved in women's networks, and certainly we think that there's a great place for women's networks. They're there to encourage and support, often to provide training, but we felt that they weren't really having an impact on getting women into more senior roles. And so what we realized was that the only way to really affect change was to work with the people that were in power, and often that was the men. So we worked with them to really get them to lobby their peers and to lead change in their own organizations. We started with a group of what we would call enlightened chairs, and very influential chairs. Interestingly, many of them had daughters who had been through university and were at working age, or they had working wives, so they got it already. And they were the first to sign up as our inaugural 30% chairs. They publicly made a declaration that they would set a target of 30% on their own boards, and they went out and they helped us to campaign with their peers to try and get them to do the same. At that time in the UK, the percentage of women on the largest 100 listed companies, the FTSE 100, was only 12.5%. And there were 21 all-male boards. So we set our target of 30% by 2015. And 30%, many of you will know, is really the tipping point when any underrepresented group can really be heard and participate. So shortly after our launch, the government then launched their own target. And their target was 25% in the same time period. Now, they had actually sat down, they'd worked out turnover rates, and they looked at what was achievable, because the government had to achieve their target. So we had growing momentum. We had a great force in the UK working on the same thing. So I'm pleased to say that now there are no all-male boards on the FTSE 100, and on the broader 250, there are now only 2 all-male boards. We're now at 30.9%. on the FTSE 100, so we've surpassed our initial target. And we now have 30% club campaigns all over the world, from the US to Australia, all with varying degrees of positive momentum. So, thank you. So what are the things that we see that really helped us to make this change? And the first one is a point that Julia made, that we firmly believe we had a measurable goal with a time frame, and what gets measured gets done. We had supportive public policy, with the government setting targets and really pushing for the same agenda. We were working with the power base, the chairs, the people that could actually make the changes. We collaborated with many other like-minded groups, and I think, just as Julia talked about women banding together, you know, we need to all work together and to be a louder voice. We had very concerted, very cohesive actions. And very importantly, particularly as this is the economic times, we had constant media attention. And that's been really key to the campaign. And we still have that today. Not a week goes by that we aren't asked to comment in the press, to go on radio, to go on TV, and to talk about this topic. And so I think that the media has been incredibly important. We've also in the UK had increased transparency through gender pay gap reporting for UK companies, and also Hampton-Alexander reporting. But it doesn't stop there, and we also aren't breaking open the champagne quite yet. We can't afford to be complacent, and there's certainly much more to be done. So at the end of 2015, we set a second campaign. We widened our target beyond the 100 biggest companies to the 350 companies, and that was for boards. But more importantly, we're now reaching down into companies and we're targeting senior management teams, because certainly we believe that it's really important to develop a pipeline and to make sure that there is parity all the way through organizations, and to have much better balance of women in senior management. Our government has moved on in the same direction as well, and the government-sponsored Hampton-Alexander review is now asking all of the FTSE 350 companies to report once a year on what their gender split is on their executive committee and on one level below. And I have to say that that reporting, along with gender pay gap reporting, is really helping. So the way that I describe our campaign now is that we're looking to influence 3 very key stakeholder groups. First, we started with the companies themselves, with the chairs, having them sign up to targets, now with the CEOs, and I'm pleased to say that in the past year and a half, we've signed up 41 FTSE 100 CEOs to set those targets. We've got 28 FTSE 250 CEOs. And we also have an HRD best practice group. We've got a strategy best practice group. We've got the largest cross-company mentoring scheme in the world. So a number of initiatives where the companies themselves are really leading change. The second key stakeholder group is public policy. So I sit on the government advisory board for the Hampton-Alexander Review. We give input into corporate governance code. In the next couple of weeks, we're giving input into the new stewardship code. And also, we've testified about gender pay gap reporting. So anything that the government is doing in this space, we're sure that we get in and we have input and we have a voice. But the third and the most important group, where we've been very active recently and growing, is with our investor group. And the power of investor capital is transformational. We have a growing global investor group with groups in Australia, in the UK, and in Canada. The UK group alone has 33 members of asset owners and asset managers representing 11 trillion sterling in assets under management. In Canada, the group has all of the largest Canadian pension funds. In Australia, the supers and the asset managers. And they're all looking at gender diversity as a stewardship and governance issue, but also as a long-term performance issue. All of our investor group members sign a statement of intent to say that they will actively engage with their investee companies on these issues, that they'll look at the process for identifying suitable candidates, not only for the board, but also for senior management. They expect transparency and evidence of a culture that has commitment to diversity. And if after engaging with the boards and with the management, they don't feel this to be true, then they hold the right to vote against the chair in the AGM. And I can tell you that that's happening. Many of our members have voted against chairs when they weren't seeing enough progress. And not only are they doing that, but they're all sharing this information. So our group meets once a quarter. We look over the list of listed companies. We look at which ones are doing well, and we aim to name and fame those companies. We try and hold up those that are examples of best practice. But the ones that aren't doing so well, we go around the room, we ask who's invested in those companies, and then we go and we ask for a meeting with the chair and CEO, and we have at least 6 or 7 investors sitting across the table to constructively engage with them. And certainly, where the money goes, the power goes, and that is really helping to change things. So how does all this relate to what's happening in India? Well, certainly in India, it feels like public policy is moving in the right direction, with the 2013 Companies Act requiring companies to have at least one woman on the board. And this has clearly had some impact. I think the last figure I saw was 14% on the Nifty 500, and that compares to a global figure of 15%. But I think we all know that that's really not enough to affect change. And so I would also argue that the real impact really comes when companies themselves see the business benefit to having better gender balance, and they start to drive that change within. So I'm guessing that whilst there are some very enlightened business and political leaders in India, the business case may not be as well understood as it is in the UK and in other countries, and culturally, things may be a bit more challenging. Looking at some stats last night, I saw that young women make up about 43% of the group of students taking the Class 10 exams, and they actually have a higher pass rate than the men at 88.5% versus 79% for young men. I also see that there are more young women enrolling in higher education than ever before, but this isn't necessarily translating into more women going into jobs, and we heard the stats that Julia mentioned earlier. I don't know if that's because they're marrying early and not working, if they aren't looking, or if they aren't being successful. But the main thing is that this is the early leak in the pipeline that needs to be addressed here in India. However, this isn't the whole picture. I suspect that the interventions required within organizations are here not very different than in organizations that we have in the UK. So there are lots of areas that need to be addressed within the pipeline. We need to get companies to stop talking about merit for the first thing. We need them to realize that they don't actually operate as meritocracies. Merit is a shorthand for a package of admirable qualities that are innately recognizable, which instantly devalues it. It's a real problem for women working in male-dominated environments where there are deeply held beliefs and norms about who is suitable for leadership. One study actually found that the companies that were the most vocal about being meritocracies were actually the most biased. And if you think about it, if they all think they're being very meritocratic, they probably don't examine their biases and they don't question themselves. We've all heard that expression, he's a great cultural fit for the team. In translation, hey, he's just like me, excellent. Or, she's great, but she's not quite ready yet. There's much more willingness usually to take risk on a man than a woman. And until companies recognize that they're not hiring and promoting on merit, they won't be able to change it. We did extensive work in the UK with professional services firms together with McKinsey back in 2012. We worked with the biggest law firms, the accounting firms, and management consultants. And after analyzing a huge amount of data, I think the firms were all quite surprised that the problem with women getting into partnership wasn't about attrition. Women and men were actually leaving in roughly the same numbers, but there was a real promotion problem. In the accounting firms, men were 3 times as likely to be partners as women. In the law firms, they were 10 times as likely. So a lot of recommendations came out, but roughly they were in 5 areas. They needed to work on a more supportive culture, on sponsorship, allocation of work, those plum assignments that are career-changing. They needed to have more agile working, and they needed to measure and monitor progress. There's that measurement piece again. After all those recommendations and actions, we did a recount in 2015, and there was a huge improvement. The law firms themselves went from men being 10 times as likely up to only 3 times as likely as making partner. But without having analyzed the data, they wouldn't have understood the true problems, and without actively intervening, setting targets, measuring and monitoring them, they wouldn't have made progress. I mentioned sponsors in that list, and I just wanted to make the point that it's really important to differentiate between mentors and sponsors. A mentor is someone that is a sounding board, someone who listens and gives you advice, but a sponsor is someone who really sticks their neck out for you. You know, they're wearing your t-shirt, they're speaking up on your behalf when you're not in the room, and they're actively pushing you forward and finding opportunities for you. Typically, men are much more likely to have sponsors than women, as there are more men in positions of influence and the relationships develop more naturally. So companies need to really develop high potential women match them with very influential and powerful sponsors. And they need to make those sponsors accountable. Another concept I just want to touch on is the concept of the accidental manager. So I think everyone would recognize that. You know, when you're in a company and someone really knocks the lights out in terms of their sales targets, or they're technically brilliant, and the reward is that they're given a management role. Sadly, that's often not a reward for the people they're managing. You know, typically, the skills that make people fantastic salespeople or they're great technicians aren't the same skills that make them good managers. And typically, they're not so interested in management. And companies don't then train them to be managers. So companies really need to spend more time training people to be managers and not to be gender blind, but to be gender aware, and to really appreciate that there are very different styles, and they need to recognize that. And finally, I just wanted to mention something that we call pink washing. So pinkwashing is when you have companies that sound great in terms of gender issues. They have all kinds of women on their website, they spend money on conferences and they put money into the women's networks. But when you look at their actual senior leadership teams, the core jobs are still all men. And they haven't actually done anything internally. And so I think, we need to challenge those companies and actually ask them what they're really doing about driving better gender balance. In reality, it's the CEO that has to actually believe that gender balance is good for their business and prioritize it like any other business goal. The companies that are really successful set those internal targets and they cascade them all the way down throughout their organizations. And so finally, just a couple of points to leave you with. And I think, we all have to think about what we're doing in our organizations to drive the change forward. So all of you here today, we talk about 500 million. We've got a huge number of people. India is becoming the most populous country. It's going to become one of the most influential countries in the world. And as I think Martin Wolf talked about in the FT this week, India is going to be leading the change, and what happens in India is going to impact everyone. So no pressure on people in the room. But I think all of you need to think about going back to your organizations and looking at, what are you doing to sponsor a woman in your organization? What are you doing to reach down and pull someone up with you? Or to reach across and be the hand in the small of this woman's back, encouraging her, pushing her forward, to take the next step, to take the new role? What are you doing to challenge the biases when you see them in your organization and to call them out? And you can do it in a constructive way. It doesn't have to be confrontational. But if we don't call things out when we see them, then we're as complicit as the people practicing the biases. And I think also we really need, all of us to think about what we're doing to create inclusive cultures. The thing that the 30% Club is really focusing on this year is dialing up the I in the D&I. You can have as much diversity as you want in an organization, but if you haven't got a truly inclusive culture where everyone can thrive, then you won't be successful. And so all of us really contribute to that inclusive culture. So I guess my call to action to all of you would be, go away after today, and we've got plenty of other great speakers to hear from, and think about what are the 2 or 3 actions that you will go back and you will do in your own organization, and how will you lead the change? We've got 500 million people in this country. Surely we can set the target for the rest of the world. Thank you very much.